One thing that really, really works is 2 words: patient safety. One way to really navigate those waters and I know what you're saying, you're adding another person to the table. This is going to prolong things. This is going to hold things up. But typically, if you're doing things for the right reasons, and you're especially looking at it from a patient safety standpoint, you can get things done quicker.
Without supplies, there's no surgery. Without products, there's no patient care. Welcome to Power Supply, the healthcare supply chain podcast focused on helping you navigate the intricacies of logistics, purchasing, contracting, and supplier relationships. Each episode, we speak with healthcare executives, supply chain leaders, and innovative entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the loading dock to strategic sourcing, from buyers to the C-suite, and across the enterprise, we tackle the real-life issues impacting the healthcare supply chain. Whether you're tuning in for conversation or inspiration, we're glad you're here. You're just in time to hear it from the source and stock up on insight. So sit back and plug into Power Supply.
On this episode of Power Supply, we speak with Mike Schiller, Senior Director of Supply Chain at AHRMM, the Association for Healthcare Resource and Materials Management, and Sarah Bush, Director of Risk Management and Rehab Therapies at Temecula Valley Hospital. Sarah and Mike have been working together to do presentations and encourage collaboration between risk management and supply chain. And they're here today to tell us about all the benefits specifically around patient care of taking the next steps to break down those silos and begin working together collaboratively. So you're going to get a lot of perspective on risk management today that maybe you haven't been exposed to before. It's an important episode. Don't go anywhere. Stay with us. We're going to be right back.
I'm Hayes Walder.
This is Gary Skinner.
And I'm Justin Poulin.
A production of 17 Studios. You're listening to Power Supply.
I am speaking with Mike Schiller, Senior Director of Supply Chain at AHRMM, the Association for Healthcare Resource and Materials Management, and Sarah Bush, Director of Risk Management and Rehab Therapies at Temecula Valley Hospital. And we're going to be talking about integrating risk management into your supply chain strategies. And I know the two of you had a chance to present on this recently. You can tell us a little bit about that as we get into the interview. But I don't think this is a very hot topic, or it hasn't been, but it should be. And we're going to talk about why it should be today. So, Mike, I'll start with you. This is your second appearance on the show. Welcome back.
Yeah, I'm a little disappointed. It's only my second. I know other people have 3 or 4 appearances in the same period of time, but that's okay. We can talk about that offline or off air. I'm just kidding. It's great to be back, Justin. I appreciate it. And I'm really excited to be presenting with my colleague here, Sarah. But you're right. Not enough people are talking about the need for supply chain and risk management to work much more closely together than they have in the past. Typically, it was whenever there was an adverse event or a recall. I probably saw my risk manager 3-4 times a year, and that was it. But I'll tell you, in the COVID and post-COVID environment, there's a tremendous opportunity and a lot of benefit to the organization when these two disciplines come together and work much more closely together than they have.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, not only with the changing landscape, but even supply chain, just as an overall general theme, getting more involved with other departments throughout the organization. We've always touched on them, but I think just the necessity to pull them in as a consultant in a lot of untouched areas previously is so critical in today's world. Now, Mike, I'm going to point everybody back to your previous episode with Brian Bartell. We talked a lot about AHRMM initiatives, so I'd be surprised if they don't know who you are and what your background is, but I'm going to point them in that direction on the prior episode. That way we get, some more life out of that episode. But Sarah, I would like for you to introduce yourself and maybe tell us a little bit about how you find yourself in risk management today?
Hi, yeah, sure. So my name is Sarah Bush, and I am the Director of Risk Management at Temecula Valley Hospital. I got into risk management actually because I was a paralegal for medical malpractice defense work. So that's kind of how I transitioned into the healthcare arena. And, risk management has just evolved completely, especially in healthcare. COVID just launched us and my field, just like supply chain, into the spotlight. Our jobs are really to protect our patients and patient safety, and just working throughout the entire hospital to ensure that we have what we need for our patients. So it's really, really important working with every department. And, since I've met Mike and we've talked about a couple of things, it's just, I honestly cannot stress enough how important it's been to work with supply chain as far as, all of the demands, supply issues we've had across the country, across the world. So this is a really, really important topic. One thing I do want to say to my peers, my risk management peers in healthcare, pay attention, get to know your supply chain people. They are very, very important and vital to your success.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I have so many questions about your experience as a paralegal, but that's not why we're here today. So I'm going to have to pull that conversation out for another time. But Mike, a huge term in the industry today is resiliency, right? And you sort of made a loose connection as you were teeing up the conversation between resiliency and that risk management piece and why it's important, and especially in this changing environment. But can you paint a picture for us of the connection between, supply chain resiliency and really the resiliency of the entire healthcare organization and the role that risk management plays?
Sure. There's a number of opportunities from a resiliency standpoint that an organization wants to begin to consider or should be considering. There's contracts and some contract language around country of origin, failure to perform. There's supplier tier analysis. You'll see other industries really engage in this, right? Where they understand further upstream their suppliers, their tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 suppliers, and where they're sourcing their products from. So these are all just really good supply chain principles to begin engaging in this post-COVID environment to build the resiliency. But there's a number of these activities that you really want to come alongside your colleagues in risk and start working on collectively. Diversifying vendor portfolios, right? You want to risk stratify your items, right? What am I buying? Let's come up with a common definition on what is critical. And then once we've defined what's critical, let's risk stratify the inventory, identify those critical items, and let's look at those suppliers, right? We've got clinically preferred products, but we're not going to be able to satisfy and provide clinically preferred products across all these product lines right now, especially in light of all the shortages. So we got to move to what's clinically acceptable. So as you're diversifying your vendor portfolios, you're identifying other sources, alternative suppliers to provide these products. There's education. There might be some clinical impact. Certainly need to look at the patient perspective when you begin to look at bringing other products in from different suppliers. So these are some key areas where you really need to come alongside your risk management colleagues.
So Sarah, what I'm thinking as I listen to Mike, in my mind, that increased variability is a risk. Right? And variability in general, just as a baseline, introduces risk, right? Because our ability to be repeatable and consistent is all of a sudden challenged. And I get it with the shortages and the back orders that we're under, it's a necessary risk. But Mike kind of reframed this to acceptable. From your perspective, is that something that's fundamental at play with how risk management looks at this? Or are there some other things that you can educate us on from the supply chain side about how risk looks at this current environment and the way that it impacts supply chain?
Oh, for sure. I think that the biggest thing that we've learned, and I have to point out, is the timing is very, very crucial. And the actual time to get things together and to look at everything from a value standpoint, from a clinically acceptable versus preferred standpoint, there's not a lot of time. One thing with risk management is that we are traditionally very reactive. And with the current state, especially with supply chain, we have to be proactive. So one thing I really want to get across today in this podcast is having that relationship with your supply chain, your department, your materials management, understanding what they do, how they do it. That will help you become more proactive. If you don't understand who your vendors are, you don't understand those diversifying the portfolios, understanding contract language from a risk standpoint, you're going to be scrambling. And you don't want to do that. When it comes to patient care, time is of the essence. I think we definitely learned that with COVID. We didn't have a lot of time to pivot. You just had to pivot. I mean, even on the supply chain piece, I know my personal experience is we were getting what we could get. You didn't have time to put people into a conference room and look at every little nuance. And is this going to work? Is it not going to work? You just have to make a decision. But again, the best way to really be resilient to that and to avoid any kind of major risk issues is to be proactive and be proactive now. Understand what you're looking at, understand the environment, what the challenges are, and then really partner with supply chain to see how you guys can get through that together. That's the biggest thing that I've learned. I cannot stress that enough with my colleagues and my peers to really, really partner with your supply.
What would be an example of that risk in contract language? Like you were saying, to understand that, could you provide like kind of an example for people to kind of anchor on?
Yeah, I think one thing you really have to look at as far as the language goes is, are there any barriers or perimeters that the vendors are putting on you that are going to tie you up that you can't get out of that contract in the future? I think that's one thing you have to look at. You also have to really look at any kind of legal implications that they're trying to avoid that you may have to absorb. That's, and of course, in time of crises, you don't want to be put in that corner. Again, which just goes back to that being proactive, really understanding the language. But those are the two major things that I would definitely look for. I'm not sure, Mike, if you have anything else to add to that piece from your standpoint.
Yeah, I think another area that you'll see hospitals really exploring now is risk share, gain share, right? So your product is going to perform, it's going to reduce, it's going to fill in the blank. And how do you measure that? And if it's not meeting what those metrics are that you decided upon, what's the risk, right? Or what's the gain share if you exceed the metrics that you've agreed upon with that supplier? But again, risk needs to really be there in helping to determine those metrics, as do the clinicians and physicians, right? And typically supply chain works with clinicians and physicians. But again, the whole focus here is, hey, let's not forget about bringing that risk manager to the conversation, bring them around the table so that collectively we could be looking at this from a broader perspective within the organization, but more importantly, looking at the patient outcomes, the benefit to the patient, but also we want to protect the organization.
Yeah, another thing that kind of sticks out in my head is I can think of some people out there that might be responding like, okay, we're bringing somebody else to the table. Is that going to slow the contracting process down at the same time that we need to speed things up because we're looking for alternatives, right? And so I'm kind of hoping you, Sarah, can tell us, like, maybe there's just guardrails that you put in to make sure that you can come to the table, but also still stay somewhat streamlined.
Yeah. So one thing that really, really works is 2 words: patient safety. One way to really navigate those waters and I know what you're saying, you're adding another person to the table. This is going to prolong things. This is going to hold things up. But typically, if you're doing things for the right reasons and you're especially looking at it from a patient safety standpoint, you can get things done quicker. The other thing I've learned too is being a partner with supply chain. And, when these things come up as far as contracts, supplies, different pieces of equipment that you need, if you're standing side by side with your supply chain people and saying, look, this is all, we're doing this for patients and for patient safety, you're going to drive it faster. People are going to listen. Don't be siloed. When you're siloed and you look like you don't know what the other department's doing or they don't truly understand your purpose, it is going to come to a standstill. But the more you understand about each other, the more you understand that we are truly driving this forward because not only is it a need, but it is for patient safety, you're going to get things done fast.
So I don't have my co-host with me today. Hayes is on vacation and Gary had a last minute emergency that came up. But Gary talks all the time about mission on this show. And if he were here, he would have absolutely heard what you said loud and clear, Sarah, and said, we need to anchor on the mission, that we're all here to deliver great patient care. And when we do that, we just succeed as an organization much better. I think that is a super valuable point that you made. Mike, I want to walk it back just a little bit. I was kind of pulling the audience into maybe a little bit more detail around something concrete that we're talking about today. But I also think it's important that we note what it's been like in the past and maybe even some of the challenges for supply chain and risk management to work together. So from your historical perspective, what's this looked like in terms of collaboration prior to maybe the last, few years?
Sure. Great question. It's been siloed. It really has. And unfortunately, there's too many silos within a healthcare organization. I always say nobody does silos better than healthcare. So it's been a siloed relationship. There usually is that. Again, it's that adverse event. It's that recall that unfortunately, has affected some of our patients, one of our patients, whatever the case may be. And that's really typically been the touch point. I think, there's been like this wall where we're legal, right? And your supply chain. And there's really, the disciplines are so separated that there really isn't a reason beyond those patient safety issues for us to come together. But if you take that step back and you put the patient at the center, not the supply, in a value-based care environment, the patient's at the center, everything becomes around patient safety. Everything revolves around patient safety. And again, these shortages, the current environment where I'm getting 80% of my products from my key trading partners, an 80%, 85% fill rate. That difference between what I'm receiving from key trading partners and the 99+% stock I have to have on the shelves in the nursing unit, that 19, 20 point difference, that's supply chain. That's alternative sourcing channels. That's different product that's coming in here. That touches the patient. There's clinical use, clinical education. So yeah, typically, again, very siloed, touch point more around legal issues, but the focus, what Sarah and I are trying to really promote is the focus is around patient safety, and it is coming together around the patient. And when you do that, oh boy, there's just the opportunities to work together are endless.
Well, you're setting this up perfectly because, I kind of wanted to look at some objections. I wanted to look at maybe what was existing that was causing things to be siloed and sort of reinforcing that, whether it was intentional or not, right? Now, let's talk about where it overlaps, because this is how we break down silos, right? Is where do we share a stake in the game? And if the game is all about the mission of delivering safe patient care, then where do we share in, certain either concerns or risk factors that really impact both departments? I think that also helps put into context, when should we be pulling in risk management? I mean, risk management's busy too. They don't necessarily need all kinds of things that don't concern them landing in their inbox and their emails. So being strategic about how we work together and putting some definitions around that is really important too. And Sarah, I think you could probably tee this up, the best, but what are some risk factors, from in your mind that really concern you that are supply chain related and where you can actually provide some help and have an impact on that patient care?
Yeah, I think, just going back to that clinically acceptable versus clinically preferred, when we're going to that clinically acceptable based on whatever reason, supply issues, recalls, you name it, we're going clinically acceptable. It's absolutely imperative that risk is involved. Biggest reason is communication, right? In healthcare, communication is one of our biggest challenges. There's so many people that we need to communicate. However, if risk is involved, they understand, okay, we're using this new product. I know it's not preferred, but this is why we're using it. These are the potential benefits. These are the potential risks of using that. Risk can kind of be your go-to person to get that information out. We literally touch every single department, just like supply chain does in the entire hospital. And we can deliver the information in a different way, saying, okay, look, I know this isn't what you prefer, but this is what we need to use. This is what you need to be aware of. And let's get that information to our staff, to our medical staff. And last but not least is the patient. Having that open communication with your patients, with your staff, so they understand what's going on with the supplies, it really reduces your risks. It reduces your liability. It reduces any kind of issues you may have in the future. And then it also helps generate more ideas, innovation. One thing that comes to mind is ventilators. When we had the ventilator shortages or the potential ventilator shortages at the beginning of COVID, people kind of panicked. We had to get creative, which from a risk standpoint, it's always really terrifying. But if you have your supply chain, you have your risk management at the table, your clinicians, and you say, okay, what are we looking at? What are our risks here? How can we make sure our patients are still safe? And everybody has that buy-in. It's really going to drive that patient care. So I think just that communication is key. That way to, if there's any possible threat in the future, your risk management team can prepare for it. That's a huge, huge factor.
So, Mike, this whole concept of clinically acceptable and clinically preferred, I'm assuming that we still are always trying to move towards preferred. It's just not realistic in this environment. So we have to introduce the concept of acceptable, and then we have to put in the strategy and the education around that to make it work so that we're still delivering optimal patient care. But I feel like there's probably like a throttle here, and you're adjusting the throttle constantly depending on the information that you're getting from your suppliers. What's that like, and what does that introduce to the supply chain in terms of management and maybe things that they need to be aware of as they adjust their strategy?
Sure. I can tell you, I just read an article where it talked about 40 some odd % of nurses are frustrated with their supply chain, right? In talking with some colleagues about that, we feel that certainly a portion of that is because of the increased use of clinically acceptable products versus clinically preferred products. Everybody wants the preferred product. This is what I'm used to using. I know how to use it. Now I've gotten a clinically acceptable product that, again, has been vetted and can be used and provide the same level of outcomes for the patient. But that's a source of frustration right now with clinicians. And I think, Sarah talked about risk touching almost every department, similar to supply chain. The more we can get that message out across the organization about product conversions, even if they're just temporary, the better prepared the organization is going to be. And hopefully we can reduce some of that dissatisfaction or that frustration with improved understanding of why we have to make this change at this time. As I mentioned, if I'm ordering my products and I'm only getting 80% of my orders, but I have to put 99+% on the shelves for clinicians, we're going to have to go with some clinically acceptable products. And that education, that communication is critical. And bringing all of those folks around the table, you made a great point that risk is just as busy as anybody else in the organization. So we want to be sensitive to that. But I think that bringing risk into value analysis teams, if they're not already at that table, that's a great opportunity, right? That's where you're looking at product substitutions. You're looking at product conversions. You're looking at utilization opportunities. And I think you need to have that voice around the table as much as you need to have the clinical and physician voice.
It's also proactive because things are changing so rapidly. That's a great place, I would imagine, for risk management to stay on top of things so that they're not a surprise and we're not reactive all the time. And I even think about that as you mentioned innovation, Sarah, and I want to tie that to innovation around strategy. It's not always technological innovation. That's what a lot of times people think of. But innovation can be just processes, right? And they can be communication flows, and that can be built around training, education, rationalization. But what about preparation? Like, are you seeing themes that help develop strategy and by being more integrated and collaborative with supply chain?
Any specific themes? Not necessarily specific themes. However, I was just about to say that proactive approach. I love that you brought that up, Mike, because risk should be at that table. I think, again, we've learned, and I hate to keep bringing it up because nobody wants to talk about COVID, but we learned so much during the pandemic. I think the overarching theme is truly to understand what everybody else is doing. It's that anti-silo theme. The more you understand what the challenges are with other departments, especially your operations, like I cannot stress that enough. There's so much focus on nursing care and clinical, but I think one positive thing that came out of COVID is that it just absolutely put operations in the spotlight, and we essentially turned into the heroes for a couple minutes, which is, I'll take a couple minutes. Just understanding the operation, how things work around an organization really, really helps. And it helps with that proactive piece of things. So I think, again, the overarching theme that I'm seeing is just understanding what each department does, what their challenges are, and then how can you get in front of it so you're preventing anything major from happening. And that is exactly where risk management fits in. That is what our job is. We want to prevent the bad stuff. We want to prevent lawsuits. We want to prevent, a tragedy with your staff and your patients. So truly understanding operations. One example I can give with this is I've been through a cyber attack, unfortunately, and I met with my supply chain manager and said, what did you do during downtime? We didn't have a computer. How did you manage that? And the way that he managed it was he had his personal cell phone, and luckily he had a lot of the contacts with his suppliers. They all knew each other, and he just was making everything continue to run smoothly based off of his contacts that he had. And what he learned from it was, I need to make a list of contacts on paper that everybody has access to. So that way, if this happens again, we're ready. We're in front of it. So again, it's having that conversation with him, understanding his operations, understanding challenges that they go through that really helped me go, how can I help them in the future if this were to happen as well?
And that really gets around emergency preparedness planning. I don't know that we are drilling or running enough drills at this point in time, but a scenario like Sarah just shared where you don't have systems, you're paper-based or you're whatever contacts you have on your phone. Now, I know I've got a lot of contacts on my phone just because my phone is tied to my Outlook account. But if Outlook went down, half of those contacts would be gone. So you start to realize some of these different things that you need to put in place. And so I think, these emergency preparedness drills are critically important. And again, supply chain, clinicians, risk. What about suppliers? How often do we bring suppliers into some of these drills, or at least our key trading partners, our primary distributor, right? So I think that that's an opportunity for us to expand the collaboration and to really strengthen resiliency and preparedness across the organization.
The contacts piece is a great example of the lack of redundancy. And so redundancy is a good thing because we have a backup, right? But redundancy also can have a negative connotation, which would mean, just a lot of extra information, a lot of extra data. And I'm kind of thinking about that along the lines of SKUs, because as we have to increase the number of SKUs to allow for clinically preferred and clinically acceptable, it almost feels like we're a little bit at odds with standardization and trying to lean out that data set, right? And so, how would you speak to that, in the context of this risk management integration? I mean, obviously there's not a lot we can do about it, but there've always been traditionally efforts to reduce the number of SKUs that we have to manage.
So it's interesting if you look at what's happening right now. You're spot on, right? Our SKUs are growing in some cases because we're bringing product in from alternative sourcing channels or alternative suppliers. Yeah, we could be adding items to our item master, inventory to our shelves. But at the same time, you're beginning to see manufacturers out there reducing the SKUs within a product category, right? They're trying to, this is really all about managing the resources they have most effectively, right? Limited resources are affecting us all. Nobody is immune from that, right? Whether it's human resources, financial resources, raw materials. So you're seeing some manufacturers either exit product lines, canceling, deleting, removing product lines from their portfolio, or I'm making these numbers up, but I've got 30 products in this category. I'm only going to sell 15 products now. These other 15, the tail end of my bell curve, we're not going to go ahead and sell these. So if you begin to think of, it's two diametrically opposed trends here where, we need to be finding more product, but we're also being challenged with SKU reduction from a manufacturing standpoint that, hey, doctor so-and-so, I can't get you this product any longer. The manufacturer's no longer making it. Or you've got a tray, right, that is no longer being produced that has 15, 20 items in it that the clinicians just grab the tray. So what are we going to do as an organization? Are there some inherent risks with picking 15 items individually, or do we need to make these trays in-house? So you begin to start to look at, again, when the product's in the center, there's ample opportunity and ample reason for supply chain and risk to come together. So managing SKU increase at the expense of utilization, but also managing SKU reduction in an effort to most effectively manage limited resources. It's a bit, you're squeezing a balloon, basically, right? You squeeze it over here, you're doing good, but then it pops up over here on the other end.
So as we kind of wrap this up, I can't believe how fast this went. Seriously, I want like 10 more minutes or 15 more minutes for this conversation. But what about some successful strategies? Because I love to just bring some actionable insights. What can risk managers and supply chain staff be doing to start to incorporate risk management and, really get closer and closer to this, optimal resiliency state that you're describing?
So I'll just say for my colleagues, my peers, any kind of proactive risk assessment that you're doing in your organization, whether it be a new service line, whether you're opening up a new area of your hospital, your organization, supply chain always has to have a seat at that table. That is how you're going to understand their needs. You're going to understand the risks that may be involved. Definitely, I always have them there. They provide insight that I otherwise wouldn't know. The other thing I would say that's really successful for me is if you go back to your root cause analyses that you've done in the past where there's been a supply chain issue, go ahead and revisit them. Go touch base with your supply chain folks and just say, hey, we had this problem in the past. I just want to touch base, make sure there's nothing else you need from me. I want to put it on your radar. Turnover is a big thing these days. It's affecting every single department in healthcare. Sometimes your newer staff don't know what the risks are. They've never heard of, things that have happened before. Let them know. It shouldn't be a secret. I feel that transparency is definitely your biggest weapon against risks, is just being very transparent. So always have your supply chain people at the table. They offer more insight than you'll ever know.
Mike, what are your thoughts?
You talked about building these relationships and, how the two departments are going to work together. It's going to be a little bit of an uphill climb, right? Again, two departments that have not traditionally worked very closely together. It's like any relationship, right? You have to establish a level of trust. You got to establish a collaborative framework to begin working within. And so there's a couple of tools that Sarah and I have pulled together. And one is just a simple grid, right? That just lists some key priorities or areas that you want to stay focused on within an organization, right? And then within those areas, those columns, right? What are some of the risks from an organizational standpoint? What are some of the risks from a supply chain standpoint? And how do we mitigate those, right? How do we reduce or eliminate entirely? And I think that that's a good start, right? You can look at this collectively from an organizational perspective. You can look at this from a patient safety perspective. Think of a Venn diagram. What are those points where there's overlap that you both come to agreement on? And then you just start to build a relationship there. And it might take longer having that extra voice at the table initially. But once the two departments get into a cadence, get into a rhythm, are working together, risk is a part of the value analysis team, that relationship is established. There's a lot of informal communication that might take place. I think you'll see that the groups will work very, very efficiently together because their mission is aligned, patient safety.
So, Mike, you mentioned you put together a number of resources. Where can they get them?
Well, we've got those on both the AHRMM and the AHRMM websites. I'm happy to provide some links to those and really just get the word out, right? This is kind of Sarah's mission. My mission is raising the level of awareness and getting some of these tools into the hands of folks to start the conversation. You have to find a starting point, and we believe that some of these tools can help to go ahead and bring those two disciplines together to start the conversation.
Yeah. And the nice thing is you're already cutting out a lot of the work as if somebody were to start from scratch on their own. If they identified this risk, you put resources together. What a great collaboration and what a great role modeling for that collaboration. I want to commend you both and, stay on the speaking circuit, continue to spread, this message, because I think it's very critical. Sarah, thanks so much for coming on. This is a supply chain mostly podcast, but I hope you will share with your colleagues so that, they can get this collaborative conversation and get exposure to it. I think having you share your insights can really help people not only start to think about this, but also get a little bit of an understanding of what it might be like if they start utilizing the tools that the two of you put together. It'll help them anticipate hearing your perspective on the show today too. So thank you.
Absolutely. It was my pleasure.
And Mike, two's a charm. I want you to know that not only is this your second appearance, but you're the second person to have a second appearance. So I think it's your lucky number.
I'm going to go buy a lottery card after this ticket. Too bad the Powerball, somebody already won it, but that's all right.
Well, Mike, thanks a lot for coming on again. I really appreciate it. This was a great conversation today.
Pleasure's mine. Thank you so much for having me. And Sarah, thanks again. It's great working with you. And I think we definitely have a story to keep telling here.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mike.
That was Mike Schiller, Senior Director of Supply Chain at AHRMM, and Sarah Bush, Director of Risk Management and Rehab Therapies at Temecula Valley Hospital. And we're talking about the importance of collaboration between supply chain and risk management, and really taking this proactive approach where, as things consistently are changing, that we can be anticipating some of those changes and the concepts of clinically preferred and clinically acceptable to create more resiliency in supply chain. Boy, I thought that was really relevant and hitting home on, with all the back orders and shortages, the day-to-day work that's being done in supply chain, and then some takeaways there on successful strategies. Certainly, we can help get you pointed in the right direction on the links for the resources that Sarah and Mike have put together. But honestly, I would encourage you, if you're working in supply chain today and listening to this podcast, to reach out to your risk management partners. Begin to build that layer of trust, like Mike said at the very end, and figure out how you can work collaboratively to really impact patient care at the bottom line. That's going to do it for this episode. But as a reminder, we would love it if you downloaded our smartphone app for iPhone and Android. That's the best way to listen to the Power Supply podcast. But you're probably already listening to podcasts, and if you are, you can still find us on Apple, Amazon, and Google Podcasts, as well as Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spotify, and honestly, there's so many podcast apps out there today. Just search for the Power Supply Podcast. Some of the episodes have bonus content, but you can only access it if you do download our smartphone app. So there's another plug there for the Power Supply smartphone application. We also love feedback. If you have an episode that was your favorite, we want to hear about it. If you have a guest that you'd like to hear, or that you think they have an important story to tell, send them our way, or just shoot us an email and connect us. Again, info@powersupplymedia.net. And on behalf of Hayes and Gary, who weren't able to join me today, I'm Justin Poulin. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Power Supply.